So thanks. Yeah, I'm Max Curran. I'm a PhD candidate at the UC Berkeley School of Information. I'm here today to present a project titled Understanding Digitally-Mediated Empathy, an exploration of visual, narrative, and biosensory informational cues. And I worked on this project with my co-authors, Jeremy Gordon, Lily Lin, Priyashri, and my advisor, John Chuang. So let's start with some motivation and background for this project. So there are clear reasons why we communicate through technology. Chiefly among them, it eliminates the need to be co-located with the person you're talking to. It eases one-to-many communication, and also you have increased control over self-presentation when you are communicating through mediated channels. In particular, you can be anonymous online, which is really difficult to do when you're in person. This communication takes many forms, one-to-many posts on things like social media platforms, one-to-one messaging and messaging applications. Often, one of the downsides of mediated communication is you have a reduced set of nonverbal and verbal cues to understand how someone is feeling. So oftentimes we'll substitute things like text, emojis, photos, links, video to kind of get across our point. An interesting practice that's kind of surfaced in recent years is this idea of live streaming, either streaming, and one example in this screenshot is a gamer streaming kind of their physical appearance while they're playing a game. Another one is things like reaction videos on YouTube where someone will watch something like a movie trailer and you can see their face react and kind of maybe understand how they're feeling that way. And these are kind of, I think, ways to kind of reclaim some of these cues that are typically lost in mediated communication. But another interesting direction that's kind of another cue that's been explored recently in HCI research is social biosensing. So what is biosensing? Biosensing is the capture and interpretation of physiological data generated from our bodies and behaviors. Includes things like heart rate and also something called electrodermal activity. It's changes in the moisture level of the skin that indicates kind of like how excited you might be or a degree of arousal. There's examples of things like this that already exist. So like the Apple Watch, for example, you can share your heart rate. But there's other really interesting research projects that are exploring kind of like what is the meaning that's interpreted in these when you share signals like this. So work by Howell at DIS in 2016, she explored these color-changing fabrics on T-shirts that depended on users' electrodermal activity during these intimate conversations. Fannie Liu has done some really interesting work looking at the expressivity of biosignals or biosense data like EEG patterns, or creating these kinds of smartwatch apps that you can share like a little animated figure that's based in part on your biosignal data. So there's the findings from a lot of this work is that these signals can increase perceived closeness. They're kind of lightweight forms of social interaction, increased sense of intimacy, and they can enhance expressivity depending on how they're represented. There's a clear relation, I think, to empathy in this work, and I don't think it's been explored with that lens yet. So that's kind of one of the impetuses behind this project. There's room for experimental exploration of this work to complement the existing work that's already out there. So what do I mean by empathy? Empathy is a term that's used a lot in kind of day-to-day discourse, and it's also used a lot in research. It has a long history of research, of research in social and psychological, or social psychology and psychology. So I'm going to put a definition up here that I'm going to use in this talk, which is the understanding and responding to the mental and emotional states of others. In an empathic situation, there's typically a target of empathy, someone who is sharing an experience or experiencing something in the moment, and an observer who is watching that person and trying to empathize with them, or trying to understand how they're feeling or feel the same things. There are a couple different components of empathy that have been talked about in psychological research. One of them is cognitive empathy. That's the perception of the mental states of another person, which is kind of the focus of this study going forward. There's also affective empathy, which is the feeling of like someone else is feeling, not just knowing what they're feeling, but actually feeling those emotions yourself. And recent research has suggested that empathy has a motivated nature. That empathy is not something that we're either born with, or either you have or you don't, but it can actually change in a situation. You can be motivated to empathize more or less. One interesting kind of component of empathy as well that's come up in recent work is mind perception, which is kind of a precursor to empathy in the first place. So you have to kind of ascribe mind perception as the process of ascribing mental capacities to someone, kind of perceiving them as another person who experiences emotions and has their own perspective, which is sort of necessary before having any sort of empathic experience. And a 2011 meta-analysis of trait empathy it concluded that there's been a decrease of 40% in trait-level empathy in US college students since the 1970s. This was self-reported empathic concern and perspective-taking components of empathy. And at a time when there are narratives and social and political division, there's narratives that social and political division is growing, and I think some of us feel that, and we're kind of questioning technology's role in this process. It's an interesting time to think about how technology might afford or discourage empathy. And we're also reimagining current forms of social media, like things like social VR. It's kind of an exciting time to think about what new forms these communications could take. So talking about what we did for this study, we had two broad research questions. The first, not broad, but pretty specific actually. The first one is how do different types of informational cues about an anonymous target affect observers' accuracy, rating the target's state, and the observer's general feelings of empathy toward the target. So this first research question we addressed experimentally. We had three different types of informational cues we were testing. One was narration, kind of a description of how the target was feeling. One was EDA, the electrodermal activity I mentioned earlier, versus a control condition that was just the content itself, which I'll kind of show what this means later on. But we hypothesized that narration would have kind of the highest accuracy, and followed by EDA, because it's some information but not very clear what it is, followed by the control condition where you don't get any extra information. And then the second research question was more qualitative. What are the observers' qualitative impressions of different informational cues? How to describe their strategies for empathizing with the target when given different informational cues? And we addressed that one with some semi-structured interviews. So what did the methods of the study look like? This is kind of a scary slide, but I'll try to go through it piece by piece. So there are two phases to the study. One is a target phase, where we kind of collected information to produce stimuli for the observers. So in this target phase, the target experienced a short film in virtual reality called Pearl. It's part of the Google's Spotlight series, and it's an animated short film described as a girl and her dad crisscross the country in their hatchback. We used VR because it was a way for the target to have an immersive emotional experience and capture things like their first-person perspective or recording what they're looking at, their EDA in kind of a lab setting, so it was a nice medium for that. So as I mentioned, we collected their field of view recording. We were able to record what they were looking at during the VR experience. We also collected their electrodermal activity while they were in the VR experience. And after they did the VR portion, they watched the video that we recorded, the field of view video, and they narrated over it and described how they were feeling when they were in the VR experience. And then they watched that video again and provided dial ratings on a dial continuously while they watched it on a valence scale. So from very negative, very positive, how were they feeling in each given moment of the video. And then they did some overall emotion ratings at the end, how they were feeling generally. And so we used that information to generate stimuli for phase 2, which is the observer phase. So in this phase, we had three different conditions. So the observers either they only watched the 2D version of the recording. So they either watched just the field of view by itself, the field of view with narration subtitles, which I'll show a picture of in a moment, or the field of view with the EDA graph. And while they watched it, they were asked to do a similar rating task continuously on the dial. How do you think this person is feeling in a moment, in the given moment that they're rating? And then we also had them answer some questions afterward about how kind of general feelings of empathy toward the target, have them rate how difficult the task was and how confident they were in their ratings. And finally, we did a 20 to 30 minute semi-structured interview with each of the 60 observers, kind of covering things like their strategy for using the information, how did they do their ratings, what did they think of the information that was provided, and things like that. And that's what the rating kind of looked like. They were on a computer and had this dial in front of them. But the stimuli, oh no. Okay, let's see if this works. So this is what the stimuli looked like. The center one here is the field of view condition. So this is just kind of the field of view, what they were looking at. The left one here is the narration condition. So this is the subtitles are generated from how the target described how they were feeling that we transcribed and put on the video. And then this one on the right is the EDA condition, where the observer could see this animated EDA graph and tried to do the ratings while they watched that. Sorry. what did we find? First, we found the full screen button. So the panel on the left here are the ratings, the average ratings of the observers in each condition. So the middle condition here is the field of view one. So in each of these panels, there's a jagged gray line in the back. Those are the target self-ratings of how they were feeling from negative to positive. And then overlaid on each of them is the average or the mean ratings of the observers in that condition. So something you can see here is that in general, the observers did pretty well. And that's because they were watching kind of the video. They could see the context in all the cases. So the empathic accuracy, which is kind of the correlation between the target self-ratings and the observers rating them, is pretty high overall. The narration condition was clearly the highest. That red line follows the jagged line pretty well. Interestingly, the EDA graph at the bottom there, you can kind of see it avoids the extremes more. And we heard in the interviews that the EDA information kind of made people second guess what they thought the target was feeling. And I think one of the ways we might see that manifest is that you kind of avoid labeling something as really negative or really positive by kind of staying around neutral. An interesting case in particular is the very ending part of the video. It's kind of this like last scene, spoiler warning, sorry, but the daughter and her father in a car, and they're getting their picture taken because the daughter's kind of become famous. And in both the field of view and the EDA conditions, the observers kind of assumed that was like a happy ending, but in the narration condition, the narrator described it as being she was confused and she kind of felt claustrophobic, and so you could see that like near the end here, the narration one follows the target's ratings more. This figure on the right is the mean across the whole time series, and we find significant differences in empathic accuracy, that correlation between all the conditions, but not in the way that we hypothesized. So it turns out the narration was indeed the highest. It was people were most accurate when given narration information. But EDA actually performed worse than with field of view. So that actual information actually reduced accuracy overall compared to not having that information at all. And then we also did we had these like kind of post-task measures, so things like the state empathy, these kind of like general empathy questions were all really high, so we didn't see significant differences there. But there weren't differences among difficulty or confidence or the overall labeling of the emotions. Interestingly, it wasn't a significant difference, but the confidence in the field of view condition was a little bit higher than the other two, perhaps because there was no other information to kind of check their assumptions of how the person was feeling. And so in our interviews, we found a couple interesting themes that are in the paper, but I just wanted to get into one of them in particular. So even though EDA kind of had this negative effect on accuracy, there's other components of empathy that might be arguably more important. So one of them, like I mentioned earlier, was mind perception, this ability or detection of the target's internal states and kind of the ascribing of human-like qualities and mental capacities to the target. So both the narration information and the EDA seem to function to kind of prompt this mind perception in the observers. So in the narration condition, one observer said, "I couldn't let my feelings get in the way. I had to look at it from what I was reading about how the narrator felt." So it was very clear that they couldn't just assume how the narrator was feeling because they're reading about it. In the EDA condition, interestingly, is somewhat of a similar response. One person summed it up nicely saying, "Sometimes I feel like there were some spikes in the graph where I thought there shouldn't be, but maybe it was because the viewer was a parent and maybe they would know some things that kids don't. Maybe that's why." So in the same kind of way, the EDA graph when it didn't behave as the observer expected it to, it kind of made them think, oh, this person has their own perspective on experiences in an interesting way. So there's some key limitations and room for future work here. Some of the limitations, there's definitely some scope limitations here. It was a controlled laboratory setting with the young adult U.S. undergraduate and graduate student population. We had a single empathy target in this study. We didn't do multiple ones, which can change the results for sure. One dimension in particular is the expressivity of the target, how much they're able to express themselves in things like narration is going to affect how accurate the observers would be. And we had a very specific operationalization of empathy. So the single dimension valence rating and on being at accuracy was a highly simplistic form of measuring empathy. Some future work that I'm interested in exploring next, kind of homing in on these mind perception humanization effects that we saw from the interviews and maybe evaluating those experimentally. Looking at things like arousal rating accuracy rather than just valence, in particular because EDA is associated more with the arousal dimension of emotion than valence. Explore non-anonymous contexts, which many of our experiences online and with each other are non-anonymous. Thinking about the affective component of empathy, and thinking about using more personally significant content to the target. So in conclusion, investigating the effects of different cues on the cognitive component of empathy, we found that while narrative information resulted in higher accuracy inferring the valence of an anonymous other's experience, the addition of biosensory information significantly lowered accuracy, which is experimental evidence echoing a lot of the related work in social biosensing, that this information tends to be perceived as ambiguous and it's difficult to precisely interpret. Qualitatively, however, we found that both narration and biosensory information served as reminders of another's presence, and that their experience may be different from one's own, suggesting that biosensory information, which can be collected and embedded automatically, could aid in mind perception, which is a precursor to other empathic processes, and in some cases could be more important than accuracy alone. Future work will continue to explore mediated empathy and related phenomena with more diverse scenarios, such as non-anonymous ones, and measures of other aspects of empathy. So thank you, and I'll take questions.
One or two quick questions. I was wondering what you think about related emotions such as compassion and also the negative version of empathy, such as like empathic distress, and what your feelings are about trying to look at those emotions together.
So like empathic concern and things like pity are often included in the discussions of empathy. And often that's not feeling like the other person, but it's like feeling bad for them or feeling sorry for them, which are interesting components. There's some work, I think her last name is Reiss, R-E-I-S-S, at Harvard Medical School, and they did a study where they looked at showing patients' EDA information to doctors to try to improve like the ability to understand how they're feeling, or to just to indicate the intensity of the emotions or the pain or the stress that patients were experiencing. Which I thought was an interesting application. But so far I haven't focused on those components of empathy in my work, but in future work I'd like to incorporate those.
We can take one more quick question while the third filter gets set up. Anyone? Yes.
Hi, Penny.
I'm Penny from Curran. Really great talk. Work. So I was quite curious about this concept of motivating empathy and responsible aggression.
Yeah.
I'm curious if you think Dr. Markey that for certain kind of cues or more or less motivated to empathize, for example, effects like that requires a lot of effort to try to narrate your experience as opposed to something mediated could be automatic.
Yeah, so the motivated empathy theory is by a psychologist at Stanford. His name is Jamil Zaki, and he actually outlines these like strategies that people can take to control their empathy. His paper is really interesting. I can't summarize it all right now, but one of them is to increase attention to emotional cues. So that could typically include things like looking at people's facial expressions or paying attention to their tone of voice. And biosignals have this interesting like quality of being an additional cue, and drawing attention to it might increase the motivation to empathize, or you can choose to pay more attention to it, and might increase the act of empathy in the first place. But yeah, I think it's really exciting to think about the ways that we could encourage or discourage empathy, and his work's really great. I encourage you